So what I'm presenting on, the title here, Angles on Authenticity and Marketing, Understanding What It Means to Be Real. And y'all have already mentioned some about me. So I'm at A&M. I was at LSU. That was my first position before coming to Louisiana Tech. And um, so brand authenticity, human brands, the intersection of those two. Those are my main areas, but also on consumption emotions. My dissertation was on suspense. I still work in that area. Um, some other things about me, just on a more personal level, is that I'm on the for service wise, I'm on the ERB at JAMS and JBR, and I've been really involved in the Academy of Marketing Science, and the Academy of Marketing Science publishes JAMS, and we've got a newer journal, AMS Review, which is focused on conceptual work. So I am past president. I was president. I spent a lot of time at AMS. I'll tell y'all a little bit about that later. But y'all should consider going to AMS. Good bang for your buck. It's actually a pretty long conference because we've got 3 full days of presentations or academics, and then we've got a big gala dinner, and then we have receptions every night, so lots of time to interact with other people. And it's a bargain at about $400 or somewhere around that. Um, and on a personal note, some things about me, I'm really into wellness, fitness, and I have a sauna and all this sort of stuff. Although I've got to have all my healthy stuff because I love wine. So I have to exercise to burn off all those wine calories. I actually have done some research in wine. And then I also love karaoke. I'm famous for Texas A&M, hosted the doctoral consortium back whenever I was a doctoral student. So I got to actually go to 2 doctoral consortiums because I went the year before, and then A&M hosted the doctoral consortium, and we had a karaoke night, and I started off the evening, and I'm renowned and remembered for that. Um, so that's a little bit about me, but I'm going to be talking about this article here because, and the reason why I don't know how many of you are really familiar with it. So I wanted to walk you through it um, because, I just feel, well, you'll see, I spent a long time working on this thing. So it's like I want to, get the word out, but I also want to talk about the process of getting it published since y'all are kind of early in your career. So that's what I'm be talking about, some highlights from the article and some of the processes and challenges with getting it published, and um, and then some potential next steps. So this article, it's a conceptual article, and this was not my intention when I started working in authenticity to come up with a conceptual article. Now, I love conceptual articles, but I'll get to that in a second, actually. So, but other than it being conceptual, so it's offering an overarching definition of authenticity and then presenting 3 distinct types of authenticity. Then the article applies these to a brand context, and then I think the most important thing is it offers distinct sets of antecedents and consequences for each authenticity type. My earlier stabs at getting this published focused more on what are the 3 types, but it didn't go into what affects these 3 types. And so I realized that, I had to come up with some sort of nomological net, and really if I wanted to get it published in a top tier journal. And so I needed to come up with some sort of antecedents of these authenticity types. I can't, and consequences. But I was really more focused on the antecedents, because I feel like most of the consequences are, well, authenticity is good and it positively affects everything. So it really, that doesn't really help. I didn't feel like that helped bring the literature, advance the literature as much as coming up with some antecedents. Um, so that's what this article also does, and how it shows how the 3 types are interrelated. And that is actually the favorite part of the article to me. because, and as we'll talk about, I felt like this is really why this literature is so confusing is because, well, they're all kind of tied together. And so I'll show y'all how they're related. So, I think conceptual articles are really important, and that's, because it's based on, obviously, well, we know it's based on definitions, logic, reasoning, and not data, and that they're really impactful. Typically highly cited. They address big picture issues. Oftentimes, they're an award-winning paper, and then also there's been a decline in conceptual articles. Um, and they're really difficult to publish. And so that's probably why people avoid them, because, it is really difficult to publish these. And, because there's so much, people have access to data so easily nowadays, and people tend to publish empirical papers with all this data that we have access to. So that's part of another reason why there's been a decline. But I've always been very attracted to conceptual articles, and part of the reason is my background. So at A&M, we've got two authors, people there, Rajan Varajan. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with Rajan. He's more in strategy, um, and some in sustainability research. But he's got 20. I emailed him to ask him that. He has 24 conceptual articles in Financial Times top 50 journals. So he had a huge impact on me because every time we'd have somebody, defend their dissertation or proposal or come in for a job talk, he would just pick them apart with the conceptual stuff without they couldn't get any, they barely got to their studies. And then the other person is Manjit Yadav, and he wrote one of the big papers, the paper I just cited on the decline in conceptual articles. So he's got 18 conceptual articles, and 10 of them are in the top 6 marketing journals. So they really had an impact on me. And so I always had this affinity toward conceptual articles. But whenever I got started in my career, I really was not planning to publish a conceptual article because I knew they were so hard and I needed to get tenure. So, that was like on the back burner. But let me, I thought before I actually go into the article itself, I want to let y'all know how long it took me to get to this point. And so I'm going to just go through. So my initial idea and interest in authenticity was before I even finished my doctorate, which was in 2004. And I mean, it was really a stupid idea. I'm not going to tell you, it was just, let's just say, people get plastic surgery, and I was wondering, if adding or subtracting, which is more authentic, or less authentic, when you add something or you subtract. Okay, so that's where I got this idea. And I sort of thought about it for a while. And then once I started my job, about a year into my first position at LSU, I got my first data collection, and this was just some focus groups. And based on that, I tried to do some survey work. And I tried to publish that at JM. We got a revision there the first time around, and then, but then it was rejected. So we actually tried to make an appeal, and we actually won the appeal. Um, the authors were trying to tell us that we should model authenticity as a formative construct. And we were basically, this is basically one of the papers that I eventually got published in Psychology and Marketing. And we talked about rarity and stability in that paper and how they're antecedents of true to self authenticity, which I'll get to later. But they were trying to say that, oh, those are formative constructs. And we said, no, these are two antecedents. So we got the appeal, and we were successful with that. But then it it was rejected on the second revision. Then we submitted it to JCR, and it was rejected there. But let me back up. So the first time, while we were trying to get that paper published, one of the big issues we kept coming into was, and we were trying to propose that true to self authenticity, which is, being intrinsic, the brand perceived as being intrinsically motivated, passionate, and committed to whatever they do. Um, we were trying to say that's authenticity, and the reviewers say, or no, that's not authenticity. These other things are authenticity. So we thought, well, okay, maybe they're right. And we were like, okay, there are three kinds of authenticity, and brand authenticity is this third one. Um, so that's where those three types first came about, was in this empirical paper. And when we came up with that, I thought I really like this. And we had the true to this, true to that idea going on, and I felt like that was actually my favorite part of the paper. So we then submitted to JCR, and it was rejected the first round. And Debbie McInnes was the editor at that time, and we really got some good feedback from her. And so we decided, and she suggested that it was too big, that we split it into two papers. So we did. So we had an empirical portion of that, and a conceptual portion that focused on the three authenticity types. And so this empirical portion eventually got accepted at Psychology and Marketing. And note that that was about 2016. So it took a while before that got published. And I could maybe talk about that story, but I have so much to talk about. So then we took that paper, we took the conceptual paper, and we submitted it to JM. And at that time, there were theory editors. I don't know, were y'all around at that time? They had, it was Ajay Kohli was the editor at JM at the time. And, oh, wait, no, I can't remember who was editor, but whoever was editor um, decided to have some theory editors. And one of them was Ajay Kohli. The other was Debbie McInnes. And so we sent it in, and we wanted to have the theory editor look at it. And we thought, it was going to go through the review process at that point. But no, they just gave you feedback. So we got some feedback from Debbie, and then we submitted it officially, where it was sent out to review. And then where did we do? Oops. Then we submitted a third time, and it was rejected. We sent it then to JCR. This is again the three types, that the conceptual three types was rejected there. And so at that time, we were just proposing three types. And I realized we needed to come up with some antecedents. Now, we had antecedents for one of the three types because that was in that psychology and marketing paper. But I was just having trouble coming up with antecedents for the other two types. It wasn't making sense. So this was a long hiatus where this paper sat around, and I was super busy. I switched to universities. I was VP for programs for AMS. I was overseeing the conferences, which was a lot of gray hair was grown during that period, and wrinkles were formed. And then during that time, I had some time, I guess, to not think about it as much. And I guess I had some divine intervention, or something happened where I started rethinking one of the authenticity types. Um, and I thought, wait, we have this wrong. We have this wrong. And I go to my co-author, Randy, and oh, he just could not. Randy's very, very strong-willed. And we got into a big old fight. And we didn't talk for months because, I think we worked on this so long, he just wanted to get it published. And I was like, no, we've got to change this. And so we were butting heads at that time. And so I worked on it by myself for a while, and I really thought about, I reworked one of the types, and I came up with some antecedents and sent it to him. and it made sense to him. And so that's how I convinced him to move on with that. And so we finally were able to submit this into JAMS. And thank God we finally got some good feedback. So I'm going to go through some of the feedback we got from the reviewers here. Got this reviewer. I want to compliment the authors on the insightful manuscript. This framework indeed helps to consolidate the varied and often confusing conceptualizations and definitions in the field. And then this reviewer, I would like to applaud the authors on their Herculean effort in reviewing and digesting the complicated and tricky conceptual space of what is authenticity and developing a framework that attempts to organize this broad area. This is not an easy task, and I think the authors have done an overall job and have delineated a framework that encompasses the many meanings that have been associated with this ever more relevant term in the context of marketing. So we were very happy to finally get some, some positive feedback, although we did have reviewer number 2. So reviewer number 2's comment was, "I'm sorry." This is the first phrase, first sentence of the review. "I'm sorry, but I really feel that my time was wasted reading this very long manuscript." So luckily we didn't have to review. I guess they got tired. They didn't like it the first time, so maybe they refused to review it after that. So we were left with the first 2 reviewers from that point on. And so it was finally accepted on the fourth revision. And so it was definitely a long process, pretty much 10 years between coming up with the 3 types until finally getting those 3 things published. And like I said, this, I did not set out to do this conceptual work on this, but it seemed like it was the most promising, and that it seemed like it needed to be done. That's what I felt like it needed to be done. I felt like it was I was hoping it was offering some clarity. So, authenticity, it's an elusive concept. This is nothing. I think we all have seen this. Almost every paper begins off talking about how, it's confusing and no one can figure out what it is. So I won't go through all of these. Well, these authors, this was way back. It's in a tourism journal. They're suggesting that it shouldn't be a concept. It's too unstable and that it should be abandoned. And then, it was still highly debatable in marketing at this time. And so at the time, previous authenticity research, so early in the day, when people would talk about authenticity, they would most of the time just use synonyms to define it: genuine, real, true. And I think, measuring that can be useful if you don't want to dig in and look at all the different types specifically. But I felt like, this is using these synonyms, you're just kind of going in circles. So we really needed to get down and figure out what is it. Now, one good thing is that eventually people were in agreement that there are different types, or at least different dimensions of authenticity. So there was agreement on that, but not much agreement on the types and the meanings. And this is both qualitative research. So research like Beverland, and that was probably one of the early research that I relied upon quite a bit. He did a lot of work on wine, authenticity in wine. But then later on, the research was attempting to come up with ways to measure these authenticity types or dimensions. And actually, that first empirical piece, the JM, that's sort of what we were trying to do. Or at least we were trying to come up with antecedents. So there was a disagreement on that. And something else that most of this research, at least the research that's looking at the different dimensions of authenticity, is treating authenticity as a higher order construct. Okay, so you've got, the first order dimensions and brand authenticity as the second order factor or dimension. And most of that research is really was focused on the, what are the consequences of this broad authenticity type. Some of it looked at some antecedents, not too much, but it was almost always looking at how it affects the higher order factor. And so what we really were trying to suggest in this, or what we are trying to suggest in this paper, is that that these different types or dimensions of authenticity, they are really separate things, and they each have their own antecedents and consequences. So that's sort of what we were trying to do with this paper. And so our framework, we sort of loosely based this on some work in philosophy, on the meaning of truth. Um, and I don't know how many of you have tried to go through the philosophy literature. It is extremely convoluted. You think the brand authenticity research is convoluted. But we tried. We tried to come up with something because we were like, well, where did this come from? We had to base it on something. And maybe there is something else out there that I'm not even aware of. Um, but basically, we were trying to, we used epistemology. So this is how people determine whether something is valid or true in the world. And we just kind of went with this theory called the correspondence theory of truth. And this is whether the truth of a statement or proposition, does it correspond or match up to some fact? So we use this correspond or match up, this idea to define authenticity. And this was basically authenticity is a consumer's perception of the extent to which an entity corresponds to a referent. So is what you see or experience, does it match up with a referent, this other point of reference? So is it true to something else? And so, you've got the referent, and so this is your point of reference, and then you are presented with an entity. I like to use gumbo as my example. I'm from South Louisiana, so we eat gumbo. And so if I go to a restaurant, so I've got my idea of what gumbo is in my head. That's the referent. I go to a restaurant and I'm served gumbo. That's the entity here. Does the gumbo match up with my idea of what gumbo is? So if there's not much overlap, then it's low in authenticity. But if there's high overlap, then there is greater authenticity. So we try to make this, when we defined it, tried to make it a continuous variable. Oh, yes, Rosanna.
Yeah. Hi. This is great. I think this is very complex, and I'm very familiar with it because I've seen it multiple times. And I love this framework. But I was curious with one thing that's amazing about this paper is that you're able, this referent entity, even though you were talking about how there's these different types of authenticity, this is what runs through all three. And I think that what makes this paper distinct from brand authenticity and then also self-perceptions of authenticity, which we see a lot in management, is that you manage to bring together true to self, but also true to objects like the ideal and that sort of thing. And I was curious, in the review process, in all your various revisions, was it to some degree, like, did you get reviewers that were either just thought about authenticity as an object-based thing, right? I ascribe authenticity to brands, versus people that think about authenticity as a sort of self? I think there's a big divide between how we see authenticity with respect to people versus how we see authenticity with respect to objects. And I think that your paper helps bridge management and marketing, which I think marketing tends to think about brand authenticity, and then there's just like all these attributes like originality, and then in management, there's a lot more self, like how do I feel authentic? Does that person seem authentic? But I was curious, like how, I don't know, like if that was a battle to like get people to understand how to organize authenticity, encompassing people and encompassing brands or objects. And like,
Well, I would say the first go around when we did this, we were trying to suggest that true to self was brand authenticity, and the other types were applied to objects.
Oh.
And so that is, and toward the end, I could show, I was thinking about presenting this first, and toward the end, talk about our old conceptualization and how I had to rethink it. What time is it? Am I running? Oh crap! It's already 10:34. Okay, let me hurry up. All right, uh, so I'm not sure. Did I answer that question, or should I keep going?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting that you thought about that. You were saying true to self as a brand, a way to think about brand. Yeah, I think yes, that does. I think I just think that this entity referent is very, very smart and organizes everything. But at the same time, I can see if you've never heard the word entity referent, to your point about how philosophy can be very convoluted, I was curious if reviewers could appreciate that terminology because it's not, I feel like, used as much as it could be in the
Mhm.
current authenticity the way people conceptualize authenticity, even though it actually does, I think, almost apply to every way that we use authenticity. But I don't think it's as widespread as it could be because it
Okay.
actually you can apply to any attribution of authenticity, but entity referent can be a mouthful for people.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should have called it true to authenticity or something like that. But I think the entity, and the entity actually may be the claim or what you state. And I think that's what we got caught up also. Um, that's, I think, because we were, for true to fact, we were basically thinking about objects, but we weren't thinking about, so like counterfeits. um Was it a reproduction or not? So if it's a reproduction, it is counterfeit, but if it's not a reproduction, then it's kind of true to fact. But we didn't think about statements. So what people state, does their claim match what is actually happening? So that, I think, that was really where that was, how we overcame this. So I'm going to try to go through this. I don't know. How quickly should I go? All right. So I'm going to try to go a little quick here. All right. So the three types are distinguished by their referent. They each have a different reference. So one, true to self, ideals, I'm sorry, true to ideal is the referent. True to fact, the fact is the referent. True to self, the self is the referent. So they're unique, but they're all the same because it's all, true to referent, or entity referent correspondence. And we kind of base this a little bit on Grayson and Martinick and Lee et al., who had three in theirs. But the indexical is really similar to true to fact, and then and iconic is very similar to true to ideal. Um, and this, yeah, so we had to reconceptualize the true to fact. And that's where I got stuck. Once I figured out, um, the true to fact, it was a lot easier. Now, we already had antecedents for true to self, because that was the paper that we published in Psychology and Marketing. And so we had those. And true to ideal is so simple that it's almost tautological, really. But it was the true to fact that was the hardest to really figure out. So true to ideal, so this is just something like gumbo, the socially determined standard. So people have different definitions of what gumbo is. Um, all right, so the ideal here is a social construct. So this is, a lot of talked about in the authenticity literature, this notion of a social construct. It's a human intervention. It's not naturally occurring. It's not fixed. It may change. People debate, you know, um, I have my mama's gumbo is different from someone else's idea of what gumbo should be. All right. Then I'm going to skip those true to ideal examples. I'm worried I'm running out of time. But let me get to true to fact. All right. So true to fact. All right. So this is a perception of the extent to which information communicated about the entity corresponds with the actual state of affairs. All right, so is what is being presented actually the case? That is kind of like how I like to think about it. So the ideal here, so the reason why these are different is because the ideal is different than the fact, which is different from the self. All right, so an ideal is fluctuates, it changes. It's because it's a social construct, but a fact, it doesn't change. So if an event occurs, it did occur. You can't go back in time and change the event. It's really associated with realism and the natural world or what's happened, and it's not sort of this you know this figment of our imagination or what we believe to be is. And so this is really about honesty and transparency versus misrepresentation and deceit. And so, I've got these out of order here. So this is some true to ideal um, types. So classic things that are true to ideal. They're classic. They're typical. And if your brand does this, is true to ideal over time, then they're steady and constant. And then I got these out of order. Sorry. I'm all out of order here. Now, y'all, I didn't realize how slow I was. Um, so the true to fact examples. So Apple, they claim that their products, they are they're assembled in China, um, but they're designed in California. So at least, they're at least admitting that they're not assembled in the U.S., but they're trying to have put out a U.S. presence. And then, inauthentic example was Volkswagen's claims that their emissions of its cars were lower than their actual emissions. All right, this is one of my favorites. I was trying to avoid soybean oil, and I saw that Hellman's is made with olive oil. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, it's made with all olive oil. But no, it's not. Um, it's the first ingredient is canola oil, so it's not 100. It's not really authentic. It implies when it says made with olive oil, sort of implying that it's made with all olive oil. Um, so these are some of the terms used to describe something that is true to fact, authentic, sincere, candid, honest. And then we've got true to self authenticity. And this is my favorite one. This is the one I've done most of my research on. So is the entity's behavior, does it correspond with intrinsic motivations versus extrinsic motivations? So are you, and so this is based on self-determination theory. And self-determination theory talks about whether a person is behaving intrinsically, and if they do so, they feel authentic. So we kind of took this and said, well, how do people perceive whether someone's authentic? So that's sort of, we're relying on self-determination theory, but it's a perception of someone else's self-determinationism, as opposed to your own self-determination. So are you perceive someone else's being intrinsically motivated versus extrinsically motivated? And so here, we suggest that this is a fixed entity, that things that you intrinsically motivated about are, pretty fixed and don't change. And so Boston beer brand. So this is a brand that the maker Samuel Adams, and they talk about that it's made by a team of enthusiastic people that are passionate about beer, versus Snapple. The consumers rebelled when Quaker purchased it, and they attempted to mainstream the brand. So basically, when brands become too commercial, they are perceived as inauthentic, true to self, inauthentic. All right. So are they passionate, dedicated, versus are they sell out or commercialized? All right. So something else, what we had to do initially, we had just these three types, and we had a nomological net for these, like antecedents and consequences. But the reviewer or the AE, they really wanted us to really focus on brands because the paper was too long. And so we had to figure out how to do this. And so we came up with all of these different manifestations of these three types. And, most of the literature, I would say, is true to ideal. Um, and and so basically, these are manifestations, you could say different levels of abstraction. It's kind of like how I like to think about it. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just go through some of the true to ideal. So the most popular one is the product category exemplar. So what is real wine? Real wine, that's wine that's made in the old country, old world wine, made in France and Italy. Texas wine is not real wine. Is it made with a cork, or is it a screw top, or in a box? That's boxed wine is not real wine. All right, then the established brand essence. So what is the brand's personality and character, and does, whatever the brand is doing, does it match up with that? So some of the prior research looks at Star Wars and how the prequel for Star Wars did not match up with how people imagined the Star Wars brand essence, and that it was rejected as being inauthentic. And then looking at designs. So this is like formulations or what, design, like, so real Coke. Um, that is the original Coke. They tried to come up with the new Coke and they changed the formula and people thought that was inauthentic. And then some products are just talked about, it's made the old-fashioned way. They don't really specify what exactly. And I think now that I think about it, I think it's very close to the product category exemplar, except they don't say what the exact way it should be made. They just say it's made the old-fashioned way. So I won't go through the rest of these. Um, I'll just go through these real quickly. Now, I should point out that we had tried to do this in previous research. We tried to have abstract and concrete levels of each of the three types, but that didn't work. And I felt like we had too many definitions. It got too confusing. So we really didn't focus on trying to define all of these. And, it could be that there are other manifestations that we've not considered either. But I think it was just sort of examples of how these things could manifest. So we then developed these nomological nets for these different authenticity types. I won't go through that. So, and so basically the way we said, each of these different reference, the way people can understand and identify the reference, it's different for each of the three types. For an ideal, it's easy to figure out what the ideal is. You know what it is, because you've learned it, and everybody has their own idea of what the ideal or the standard should be. But true to fact, a fact in itself, difficult to determine what is factual. It's difficult to determine what a fact is. So you need to use cues to determine both a fact and someone else's self. So you have to rely on cues. You can never understand and know what someone else intrinsically motivated. So you have to see, follow these cues. All right. So based on that, we've got several, we come up with 23 testable propositions, and also we also believe that each of these antecedents and consequences and nomological nets provides support that these are actual authenticity. And that was, it wasn't simply that, so all the prior work comes up with these types. But how do we know that those are the three types? And I think one way we were trying to solidify, yes, these are at least different types. Maybe there's a fourth type that I'm not aware of, but the way to basically substantiate that these are separate and distinct is if you have separate and distinct antecedents. So I won't go through all of these, but with true to ideal, it's pretty simple. If someone sees, if you see if you try some gumbo and it matches your gumbo. There is a correspondence between the gumbo you served and what you believe is gumbo. You're going to think it's classic traditional gumbo. All right, so I'll just go with that one. Now, the true to fact. So how do people come to believe something is actually the case? And this is a good question with all this fact checking going on. It's very, very hard to determine what the facts are unless you were actually there. But one way people come to believe what is factual, if it's repeated over and over and over again, then you're more likely to believe it's true. And then if something's really unusual and out there and is, inconsistent with your prior beliefs, you're probably going to reject that. So if some unusual claim, somebody comes up with some weird thing and you're going to say, oh, that's silly. I don't believe that. So you're less likely to believe that claim is true if it's too out there or unusual. And so for true to self, okay, so how do you come to determine whether someone's intrinsically motivated? Well, if they keep doing something over and over again, they are probably, believe in it. If they keep persevering and keep focusing on and doing the same thing over and over again, they probably love what they're doing. If they're flip-flopping and changing all the time, then they probably don't. And then the rarity part, this is about, going, um, differentiating or going against the grain, going against the norm. When you go against the norm, then people are likely going to believe that you really care about that. Because a lot of times you're going to get a lot of flack for being different. It's going to be hard. It takes courage to go against the grain and do things differently. And if, so you must, why would you go through all that hassle and all of that, all these people rejecting you because you're doing things differently, unless you truly believe in that and doing it that way. Now, this to me is my favorite part, and I only have 10 minutes, but I think these three authenticity types all interrelate with one another. They can affect one another. This is why I think the literature has been so convoluted and complicated. So I'll try to go through this real quick. So true to ideal. So this is the first, true to ideal. If something follows, is consistent with what the ideal is, then you're going to believe it's the real deal. And I just came up with this term this morning. I call it the antiques roadshow effect. Okay, so if you've ever watched, I don't know if y'all are familiar with this show. It's on PBS, but they go around the United States, and people come up to these experts that know everything about antiques, and someone will say, is this gun, I think this gun came from the Civil War, and the expert looks at it and looks at all oh yeah, well, this is how it was done in the Civil War, this is how it meets all the criteria, so therefore it is probably a gun from the Civil War. If it doesn't meet those criteria, oh well, it's probably not a gun from the Civil War. Now, it could go back the opposite way, where true to fact might affect perceptions of whether or not someone's being factual is going to affect true to ideal. And I believe this is Beck's beer. Beck's beer, that's a German beer. And people realized that if they looked at the back of the can, oh, wait a minute, this is made in Dallas. So they are trying to keep this from me. And on top of that, it's not consistent with, beer made in Dallas is not German beer. Okay, so now then true to fact. And I think these two are really they are intertwined in a lot of the literature, especially like the greenwashing literature. So basically, I like to think of it backwards. So if someone is being dishonest, then you're going to perceive that they are probably extrinsically motivated. They're in it for the money. If you're perceived that they're telling the truth, then you're more likely to believe that they're doing it because they love it. But they certainly, if you think of it in the opposite way, if people are being deceptive, then they are probably not doing whatever they're doing for intrinsic reasons. They're probably doing it for money or extrinsic reasons. And then lastly, this one here is, true to ideal, if you look at true to ideal, if a company is true to ideal and they do it over and over again, like so a traditional brand, and they do make it the traditional way, then they have stability. They're being stable, and because they are being stable, then they're going to be perceived as true to self. I just mentioned when you do it the same way over and over again, you're going to perceive that those people believe that that's the right way to do things, and that they are being intrinsically motivated. They're doing it this way over and over again because they believe that's the right way to do it. Yes, Catherine.
It also feels related to your idea of sort of like costliness being involved in this. Like for a lot of manufacturers these days, it's going to be more costly to stay true to that ideal. So in addition to them having this piece of stability, it's like they're probably like, rather than changing to some kind of cheaper, less ideal manufacturing process, they're choosing to retain that ideal. So that feels like almost both of your ideas hit there.
Yeah, actually, this is what, I think you may be talking about Keith Wilcox's recent work on traditional methods, and how that's perceived to be as a higher product quality, and they're trying to better the world, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And um, yeah, so I think this is why things have been confusing in the literature, is because these three things are very much intertwined with one another. And I'm not going to go on to my next slides because I see it's already 10:56. I can't believe I spent way too much time talking about myself instead of my research. But what we contend and we are trying to suggest is that for the research to move forward, trying to come up and suggest what affects this general notion of authenticity is not the best way to move forward. The best way to move forward is to focus on each of the three types, and even more specifically, if you go back to, let's just talk about true to ideal. Are you talking about the product category ideal? Are you talking about the brand essence ideal? And Spiegel's work on brand extension authenticity, almost all of the three of the four authenticity types that they come up with are they are basically these different levels of true to authenticity ideal. So I think that that's what we believe, is that to move research forward, looking at and delving into these specifically, instead of looking at, so that requires that you have a good definition and good measurement of those. And like I said, I think these two get intertwined in the literature, that they don't get separated out. And it's kind of hard to separate those out, so with greenwashing, you might be lying about, whether or not you're doing eco-friendly things. Therefore, you probably don't care about the environment. But I feel like those two things are typically confounded. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should say, because it's already 10:57 and no one has questions, but I could stick around a little longer if y'all can. Apologize for getting off to such a slow start. Oh,
No, that's totally okay. Thank you.
The one I know that this model is really great. I do wonder, because we have management people here, that I wonder to what extent true to fact overlaps with honesty or morality or these sorts of things, which I think have this conceptual bleed with being true to yourself, right? So there's being a moral, honest person, which I think could bleed over into true to fact, right? Like it's a tricky, I think there's a challenge of what is authenticity with respect to a person, like moral character, not lying, that kind of.
I've been thinking about true to self in terms of like innovation. So if you think about innovation, I think innovators are trying to improve the world. They are trying to bring up everyone's standard of living and well-being. And so I think that's what true to self is really about. And then true to fact is more about being deceptive. But back to this, so I guess if you think of true to self in that way, you're being moral. You're trying to better society by producing the best products as possible. And this is where, are you going to do it the traditional way, which is, if we go to, let's see, go here. Are you going to do it the traditional way, the old way, and be stable? Are you going to do it the old-fashioned way? The old people who do it the old-fashioned way, they are going to be perceived as, trying to do it the best way. They're doing it because that's the best way. But then you've got the people who maybe they're the innovators and they are trying to break free and do things differently, and they're criticized. But they believe that the new way is the better way. So I'm sort of thinking of it in those terms. And so this whole idea of morality, I think, maybe be thought of in that context about, how can how can innovators and managers, improve well-being, offer more value? Jacob.
It's very interesting. I am one of those management people that Rosanna was talking about, and I agree that the true to fact idea does seem to be it could be conflated with this idea of sincerity, honesty. Right now, we're writing a paper about awareness and about how self-awareness is an insufficient mechanism to be able to really know oneself. I apologize for my voice. And one of the questions that we've been asking, or that I sort of could infer from your theorizing, is whereas you're interested in a brand and you're interested in a market-based perception, when you're talking about a person, one way in which this sort of morality that Rosanna's talking about could be invoked, and especially with respect to this old-fashioned versus new fashion, is what are the contextual norms in which a person is evaluated, or a market, product, or category in your context. And I was just thinking, what about definitions of authenticity for Gen Z or Gen Alpha as opposed to millennials or Gen X or whatever? What is the ostensible marker of authenticity for people across those generations, for which the old-fashioned way with respect to a product might signify, yeah, we do things the old ways, the way that they've always been done, versus how does that change over time in a way that is transparent, accurate, believable? Because in my perception, as a millennial man from the United States, it seems like the idea of transparency and disclosing these behaviors are more typical for someone of my demographic than of someone who's 50 years older than me, for example, and a straight white male from North America. So there could be sort of this change in what is perceived to be real when it comes to what a person is, how a person is evaluated given the normative context in which they operate. And I'm not quite sure how that relates to determining whether a company or a product is authentic, but it does seem related. And it makes me think that we are all in our different disciplines trying to figure out what the heck this means. And there's going to be stuff that is useful. And in fact, in one of the papers I'm writing, your paper has now been mentioned as a very useful way to think about this idea of reference. And that's my reflection based on what Rosanna was sort of maybe rhetorically asking, but I had an answer for it.
Yeah, I haven't, we did some research on here. So we did, this was on celebrity authenticity, and we looked at rarity and stability. They were higher order factors, and they both kind of are higher order factors, and how that influenced authenticity. Now, we did not measure true to self in terms of passion, commitment. It was just like genuine, true, not fake. But we did find a really interesting interaction with age. And we found that stability had a much stronger effect for older people than for younger people, and that rarity had a much stronger effect for younger people than older people. So it sounds kind of like what you're talking about, although it seemed like you were talking about true to fact authenticity. And I mean, it may be Oh, actually, it's backwards, right? You were saying that younger people would think that true to fact is more important. Is that what you were kind of suggesting?
No, I was more talking about the specific terms that would be seen as authentic. Yeah, it would be more about it's wiggly, honestly, to try to determine how a person is evaluated. So I'm not totally sure how I make sense of my comment, but what you said in terms of stability, age, rarity, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that I really can't remember exactly how we came up with this. I'm pretty sure we did not have this hypothesized ahead of time. We just were playing around with the data and we found that. Then we had to go back and find the theory to support it. But I mean, I was really surprised that, usually, I don't know, I guess they sort of, usually when you have some sort of moderation, it's kind of the same direction, they're both, if the higher the age, then the stronger both the effect for rarity and stability. But it's almost like rarity and stability are opposites. And actually, it kind of reminds me of, I don't know how familiar you are all with the brand coolness literature. Are y'all familiar with that literature? Because I think it's, being cool, it could either be sort of being iconic, which is, there are lots of dimensions of brand coolness. There are like 10 or something, but you could kind of clump them into two big categories that to me are very similar to stability and rarity. And they talk about how cool brands start off as being the rebels. So they start off being rare, then over time, they become iconic, so um, Rosanna, I just saw your article mentioned in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago with the
Yeah,
Chuck Taylor shoes. That was
yeah.
cool, very cool. Congratulations. But the Chuck Taylor tennis shoes and how those are probably rare and new and different when they were first introduced, but now they've become iconic. They haven't changed at all. So I think that brands, this whole idea of innovation and going through these stages where you're first the rebel and then you become the icon, and then I don't know, maybe at some point someone takes you over. But I guess um, I guess nostalgia has a lot to do with that. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, it was already 11:06. I could stick around any longer if any of y'all want to ask some more questions. It's totally up to y'all.
Well, I think thank you so much, Julie. We're at time. So I know people might have meetings to go to, but let's all, sorry people had to go, but let's all give a round of, or whatever we do with this little round of applause with uh, yeah, thank you so much, Julie. This is such a impactful framework, and I'm hoping that people, use it. I think it's very elegant and speaks to a lot of issues. So, and it was great to hear your journey of how much work it takes to get a conceptual piece published.